Angela Jackson was a nurse, and not just any nurse. She was one of the best at City General Hospital. Her patients loved her for her warm smile and the way she made them feel cared for. Her colleagues admired her for her skills and how she never lost her cool, even on the busiest days. Angela was the kind of person who gave her all to others, even when she had nothing left for herself. It had been a long day at the hospital. Angela had worked a 12-hour shift, moving from patient to patient, handling emergencies and comforting worried families. By the time her shift ended, her feet were aching and her head felt heavy. All she wanted was to get home, eat a warm meal, and rest. But first, she needed to stop at the grocery store. Angela parked her car outside the small local market. The lights inside the store were bright, and it was quiet, with only a few shoppers browsing the aisles. She grabbed a small basket and started picking up a few things she needed: milk, bread, and a box of tea for her nighttime relaxation. As she walked through the aisles, Angela couldn't help but notice how peaceful everything felt. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of her day at the hospital. She let out a deep breath, feeling a little lighter. She smiled politely at the cashier as she passed by and continued to browse. In the corner of the store, Angela spotted a lovely purse on a display rack. It was a sleek design, elegant and simple, the kind of thing she rarely treated herself to. She walked closer, admiring it from a distance. She thought for a moment about how nice it would be to own something like that, but quickly shook her head. Not today, she murmured to herself, smiling softly as she turned away and walked toward the checkout counter. Little did she know, her peaceful evening was about to take a turn she never expected. As Angela waited in line to pay, a woman behind her suddenly stepped forward, holding a purse. "Excuse me," the woman said loudly, her tone sharp and accusing. "You're trying to walk out with this, aren't you?" Angela blinked, confused. "I'm sorry," she asked, looking at the purse the woman was holding. It was the same one she had seen on the display rack earlier. "You were over there near the purses," the woman said, her voice rising. "I saw you. You were acting suspicious." Angela's stomach sank. She looked around, noticing that a few other shoppers had stopped to watch. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake," Angela said calmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't touch that purse. I've been here to get groceries, that's all." But the woman wasn't listening. "I'm calling the manager," she declared. Angela stood frozen, a sinking feeling growing in her chest. This wasn't just an accusation. It was something much bigger, something she didn't deserve. The store manager, a tall man with a stern face named Mr. Willis, approached quickly, his expression serious. Angela watched as the accusing woman waved the purse in his direction, her voice loud and indignant. "This woman tried to steal this purse," the woman exclaimed, pointing at Angela. "I saw her near the display. She was acting so suspicious. She was going to walk out with it." Angela's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "That's not true," she said, her voice firm but steady. "I didn't touch that purse. I was only looking at it for a moment. Then I walked away." Mr. Willis glanced at Angela, then at the woman holding the purse. He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Let's all calm down," he said, though his tone didn't feel calming. He turned to Angela. "Ma'am, do you have any explanation for this?" Angela clenched her hands tightly around her shopping basket, her knuckles turning white. She looked Mr. Willis in the eye and said, "I don't know what she thinks she saw, but I didn't take anything. My basket has groceries, milk, bread, tea. That's all." The accusing woman cut her off. "She's lying. She's trying to play innocent." Angela's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to yell, to scream at the unfairness of it all. But instead, she took a deep breath. "Check my basket," she said calmly. "I have nothing to hide." Mr. Willis nodded and took the basket from her hands. He carefully looked through it. Just as Angela said, it only contained the groceries she had picked up. Still, The accusing woman wasn't satisfied. Maybe she hid it somewhere else. The woman insisted. People like her always have tricks up their sleeves. Angela froze at those words. People like her. She knew exactly what the woman meant. Her chest tightened, and for the first time, she felt a wave of anger rising. She looked at Mr. Willis, hoping he would see through the woman's baseless accusations. Instead, Mr. Willis sighed again. "Ma'am," he said to Angela, "this is a serious accusation. We need to take this matter seriously." Angela stared at him in disbelief. "But there's no proof I did anything wrong," she said. "You've checked my basket. I don't have the purse." Mr. Willis hesitated, glancing at the accusing woman, who was glaring at Angela like she was already guilty. "I think we should call the police to sort this out," he said finally. Angela's heart sank. "Call the police," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly now. "You're treating me like a criminal for something I didn't do." But her words fell on deaf ears. The woman nodded in approval, and Mr. Willis picked up the store phone to make the call. Angela stood there, feeling a mix of frustration, fear, and disbelief. She had done nothing wrong, but now she was at the center of something that felt so much bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The sound of the phone dialing echoed in her ears as she braced herself for what was to come. Angela stood frozen near the checkout counter as the accusing woman smirked, her arms crossed. The store felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. Shoppers whispered to each other, their curious eyes darting between Angela and the manager. She could feel their judgment, even though none of them knew the truth. Minutes later, 2 police officers entered the store. They wore sharp uniforms and carried an air of authority that made everyone step aside. Angela felt her heart sink further as they approached the manager and the accusing woman. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked one of the officers, his voice calm but professional. The accusing woman wasted no time. "That woman," she said, pointing directly at Angela, "tried to steal a purse. I saw her near the display, acting all suspicious. I'm sure she was planning to walk out with it." Angela's throat felt dry as the officers turned their attention to her. She stood tall, trying to maintain her composure, even though her hands trembled slightly. "Ma'am," said the second officer, his tone neutral but firm, "can you explain your side of the story?" Angela nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't steal anything," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I was looking at the purse for a moment, but I didn't touch it. I only came here to buy groceries." One of the officers glanced at the basket still sitting on the counter. It had already been checked by the manager, but the officer inspected it again anyway. "This is all you're purchasing?" he asked. "Yes," Angela replied. "That's all. I didn't take anything else." The accusing woman huffed loudly. "She probably hid the purse somewhere before you got here," she said. "You can't just take her word for it." Angela felt a spark of frustration rise in her chest. "Why would I hide something I didn't steal?" she asked, her voice firm but calm. The officers exchanged a look. One of them turned back to Angela. "Do you have any identification with you, ma'am?" Angela hesitated for a moment, then reached into her purse and handed over her ID. She watched as the officer studied it, his expression unreadable. "You're a nurse?" he asked, glancing at the ID. "Yes," Angela said. "I've worked at City General for years. You can call them to verify if you need to." The accusing woman rolled her eyes. "A nurse? That doesn't mean anything. I know what I saw." Angela clenched her jaw, biting back a response. She could see that the officers were trying to remain impartial, but it felt like they were leaning toward the woman's story. "We'll need to review the store's security footage," one of the officers said finally, addressing the manager. The manager nodded, but Angela could sense hesitation in his movements. "Oh, I'll get the footage," he said, glancing nervously at the accusing woman. As the manager walked away, Angela stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She knew she was innocent, But the doubt in everyone's eyes made her feel small and powerless. She had no choice but to wait and hope the truth would finally come to light. As the minutes passed, Angela stood in the store, feeling more and more like a prisoner in her own life. She could hear the officers talking quietly with the store manager, but her thoughts were too loud to focus on their conversation. Every glance from the people around her felt like another judgment, another accusation. Then, something unexpected happened. A young man who had been standing near the entrance the entire time pulled out his phone and started recording. Angela noticed him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He seemed to understand, and his gaze was kind, but it also carried a sense of purpose. He was recording everything. Angela didn't know what to think. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? She couldn't help but feel exposed. But deep down, she knew that whatever was happening needed to be seen. People needed to understand the truth. The young man stepped closer to the officers, holding his phone up. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but I'm recording this. It doesn't seem right for her to be treated this way without clear evidence." The officers glanced at him, but said nothing, their attention still focused on the store manager. The young man wasn't discouraged. He simply moved to a better angle, continuing to film the entire scene. A few more people gathered around, and soon whispers filled the store. "That's Angela Jackson, right? The nurse?" one voice asked. "I've seen her around. She's always so helpful." Another voice joined in. "Yeah, I don't believe this for a second. I've never seen her act in a suspicious way." The accusing woman, still holding the purse, turned around sharply. "This is ridiculous. She's guilty. You don't know her." The young man didn't flinch. "I don't need to know her. I know what I'm seeing. This is wrong." Angela was stunned. It was one thing for people to stand by and watch, but for someone to speak up for her like that, it made her feel less alone. As the young man continued recording, people around him began to chime in too. "We're all just trying to live our lives. We don't need this kind of thing happening." Another woman, who had been quietly standing nearby, finally spoke up. "I don't know what's going on, but I know that nobody should be treated like this without proof." The atmosphere in the store shifted. The accusing woman became agitated, clearly uncomfortable with the growing attention. "I'm telling you, she was going to steal it," she repeated, but her voice was less confident now. Angela could feel the weight of the situation lift slightly. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't facing it alone. People around her were speaking out, supporting her without knowing her, without having any reason to believe in her except for the basic truth: she hadn't done anything wrong. It wasn't much, but it was something. The crowd's growing support was like a small flame of hope in a dark room. Angela didn't know how this would end, but for the first time that day, she allowed herself to believe that the truth could win. The officers, finally finishing their conversation with the store manager, returned to Angela. But now, the store felt different. The eyes around her had changed. The eyes that had once judged her now held a mixture of curiosity and hope. Angela was no longer just a person caught in a misunderstanding. She was someone whose truth people were starting to believe. The store manager finally returned with a small video player in his hand, the security footage ready to be shown. Angela felt her heart race as he plugged the device into a small screen on the counter. The officers stood close by, watching the screen, but Angela could hardly focus on what was being said around her. She had no idea what the footage would reveal, but she desperately hoped it would prove her innocence. The accusing woman stood just behind Angela, still holding the purse with a tight grip. She was no longer shouting, but her eyes still held that sharp, judgmental glare. Angela could feel the tension in the air, thick like a storm cloud ready to break. The footage started, showing a clear view of the store aisle where Angela had been moments before. The video zoomed in on the display of purses. Angela watched herself, standing there, quietly looking at the purses with interest. She could see the exact moment the accusing woman had walked by, and then everything was clear. Angela had only glanced at the purses, then walked away without ever touching anything. The officers leaned in, watching closely as the footage continued. Angela's breath caught in her chest, hoping this was the moment that would end everything. And then it happened. The accusing woman was shown walking directly toward the display, stopping in front of the purse Angela had briefly looked at. Angela watched in disbelief as the woman picked up the same purse, looked at it for a second, and then, without hesitation, walked toward the checkout. For a moment, Angela couldn't speak. The truth was right there in front of her, clear as day, yet she knew that the damage had already been done. The woman had made the accusation, and now Angela's reputation had been questioned, despite the proof. The first officer glanced at the other officer and then back at the video. "It seems like there's been a misunderstanding," the first officer said, his voice calm but not without a hint of hesitation. "The footage shows that the purse was never taken by this woman." Angela's heart skipped a beat. It was over. Finally, after all the stress, the uncertainty, and the hurt, she could breathe again. But it didn't feel as sweet as she had imagined. The damage to her sense of trust, to the way people saw her, was still there. The accusing woman's face went pale. She stammered, trying to find words, but none came. Angela couldn't help but feel a twinge of anger. After everything she had been through, the woman could at least apologize, but instead, she stood silent. The second officer spoke, his voice colder now. "I suggest you leave the store before things escalate further," he said to the accusing woman. With a final, angry glance, the woman stormed out of the store, leaving Angela standing there, still holding her breath. The tension in the air began to lift, but the emotional weight remained. The officers turned back to Angela, who was now standing in stunned silence. "You're free to go," the first officer said. "Sorry for the trouble, but we had to follow procedure." Angela nodded, still not fully able to process everything that had just happened. The store manager, now visibly relieved, apologized repeatedly for the mix-up. As Angela walked out of the store, she couldn't help but feel a sense of both relief and disappointment. The truth had won, but she knew it would take a long time to shake off the sting of what had happened. The world hadn't been kind to her today, but somehow she had survived it. And that, she decided, was a victory in itself. After the incident at the store, Angela felt drained. Her whole world had been turned upside down by a simple accusation, and even though the truth had been revealed, the emotional toll of it all lingered. But as the days passed, something amazing happened. People began to stand up for her. It started small. A few nurses from City General reached out, sending her messages of support. They told her they believed in her, that they knew she would never do anything wrong. Then, a few of her patients' families started calling her, expressing their concern and offering words of encouragement. But the real turning point came when the video of the store incident went viral. The young man who had recorded the entire situation posted the footage online, and soon it was being shared by hundreds, then thousands of people. Angela had no idea just how far it would reach, but as the days passed, she saw her story pop up in news articles, social media feeds, and even local TV reports. People from all walks of life, people who had never met Angela, began to rally around her. They shared their own stories of unfair treatment, of being accused without evidence, of facing challenges simply because of their race or profession. The hashtag #StandWithAngela quickly gained traction, and soon it became a movement that was about more than just one woman's struggle in a grocery store. It was about standing up against unfair judgment and bias in all forms. Angela felt both humbled and overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. She never imagined that something so painful could bring so many people together. But as the messages and posts kept coming, she began to feel a small spark of hope. The world wasn't as cold and indifferent as she had thought. People cared. The local news even invited her to speak on a segment about her experience. At first, Angela hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to talk about it on such a large scale. But after talking with her friends and family, she realized that this was her chance to turn the pain into something positive. She could help raise awareness about the struggles of Black professionals and show others that they didn't have to stay silent when faced with injustice. When the day of the interview came, Angela sat in front of the camera, nervous but determined. The host greeted her warmly and asked her about the experience. "What was it like, Angela, to go through something like that in a public setting?" Angela took a deep breath before answering. "It was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced," she said quietly. "But I also realized that I wasn't alone. So many people reached out to me, shared their stories, and said they believed in me. It gave me the strength to keep going." As the interview ended, the host thanked her for her courage. Angela smiled, but inside, she felt different. This was no longer just about her. This was about the power of community, about how standing together could bring change. When she walked out of the studio, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't had in days. The world hadn't been kind to her, but she was stronger now, not because of what she had gone through, but because of the support she had found in others. Angela knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with the community standing behind her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Days after the interview, Angela began to notice a shift. The support from the community didn't just fade away after a few weeks. It kept growing. People continued to share her story, and slowly, the recognition spread. What started as a simple, misunderstood incident in a grocery store had turned into something much bigger, a conversation about trust, fairness, and racial prejudice that people were starting to take seriously. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, Angela was sitting at home when she received a call from an unexpected number. It was the police department. The officer on the other end of the line introduced himself as Officer Harris. He had been assigned to look into the situation further and wanted to speak with her. Angela's heart raced. Was this another step in the process, or was something else happening? With a mixture of nervousness and curiosity, Angela agreed to meet with him. When they met, Officer Harris apologized right away. "I want to start by saying that we made a mistake, and I personally regret how this situation was handled," he said. "We should have looked at all the facts before jumping to conclusions." Angela listened carefully, unsure of how to respond. She had been through so much already, and after everything that had happened, she didn't know if an apology would ease the hurt. "The truth is," Officer Harris continued, "we never should have ignored the support you had in the store that day. The video, the witnesses, they all proved that you were wronged. I'm sorry for the way it was handled, and I want to make it right." Angela nodded, but the weight of it all still hung heavily on her shoulders. She had always believed in fairness, in the justice system, but now she wasn't so sure. The system had let her down when she needed it most. "I appreciate your apology," Angela said quietly, "but it still feels like I'm the one who has to carry the burden. I had to fight for something that should have been clear from the beginning." Officer Harris didn't argue. "You're absolutely right," he agreed. "It shouldn't have come to this. But I can assure you that we are taking steps to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. We're working on training for officers to be more aware of biases, both unconscious and intentional, and we're implementing better procedures for handling situations like yours." Angela was silent for a moment, thinking about everything she had been through. The stress, the fear, the uncertainty. But then she took a deep breath. "I'm glad to hear that," she said slowly. "But more than anything, I hope this changes things for others. I don't want anyone to go through what I went through." Officer Harris nodded. "I promise you, we're going to make things right, and I'll do everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again." As the conversation ended, Angela felt a small sense of closure. She wasn't sure if things could ever go back to normal, but the apology, combined with the actions being taken, gave her hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the system was starting to change. When she left the meeting, Angela felt lighter than she had in weeks. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step forward. And that, in itself, was something worth holding on to. The days after her meeting with Officer Harris were a whirlwind for Angela. It was clear that things were beginning to change, but the process wasn't as quick as she had hoped. The store, the police, and even the community had begun to recognize the weight of the situation. But for Angela, the emotional scars still lingered. The incident had shaken her to the core, and she wasn't sure if she could just forget about it and move on. But one thing became clear: Angela wasn't alone anymore. A few days later, the store's manager called her, sounding apologetic. "Angela, I want to personally apologize for how everything went down. I didn't handle the situation well, and I deeply regret how we treated you. We should have believed you from the start." Angela listened quietly, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. It wasn't every day that a business owner took responsibility like this, but she appreciated his words. He continued, "We've already taken steps to ensure our staff is trained in how to handle accusations more fairly. I'm also donating to a local organization that works on racial justice and equality, and I wanted you to know that your experience is a part of why we're making these changes." The apology felt important to Angela, but it wasn't enough to erase the hurt. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate you making the effort to fix things, but I hope this goes beyond just saying sorry. People need to know that their voices are heard, and that they're not alone when things like this happen." The manager agreed. "I completely agree. We're going to make sure it's not just talk." That evening, Angela sat down to watch the evening news. To her surprise, there was a segment about her case. The reporter spoke about the viral video, the community support, and the steps being taken to address the issue. Angela could see herself on screen, her face calm but serious, talking about the need for fair treatment and understanding. The store's manager and Officer Harris both appeared, discussing how they planned to make sure similar incidents wouldn't happen again. It was a strange feeling, seeing her own story unfold on television. On one hand, it felt validating to know that the world was finally seeing what she had endured. But on the other hand, it was painful to relive it all. She thought about the long days she had spent feeling powerless, the stares, the whispers, and the uncertainty. She wished she could tell the world how much it had hurt, but instead, she just watched in silence. The next day, Angela received another unexpected call. This time, it was from the police department again. They informed her that the woman who had accused her was being charged with making false accusations. Angela was stunned. She hadn't expected anything like this, but as she listened, she realized that it was a small victory. While it didn't undo everything, it showed that accountability was possible. As she hung up the phone, Angela felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't just the apology that mattered, it was the actions that followed. People were starting to take responsibility for their mistakes, and for the first time in a long time, Angela felt like her voice had been heard. She still had a long road ahead, but now there was hope. There was change. And for the first time in weeks, Angela believed that the future might be brighter than she had thought. As the weeks passed, Angela began to find a new sense of purpose. While the incident at the store had taken so much from her, it also gave her something she hadn't fully recognized before: the power to make a difference. The community that had supported her, the voices that had spoken out in her favor, had sparked something in her. She wasn't just a victim of a misunderstanding anymore. She was part of something bigger, a movement for fairness, understanding, and justice. Angela decided to take that power and use it to help others who had faced similar struggles. She became involved with local organizations that focused on racial justice, equality, and advocating for the rights of Black professionals. Angela started speaking at community events, sharing her story with people who had once felt alone, just as she had. She talked about what had happened to her, not just as a personal experience, but as a call to action for change. She spoke about the importance of listening to people, especially when they are vulnerable. She told her story at schools, hospitals, and local gatherings, urging people to recognize the biases that might unknowingly influence their actions. Angela wasn't just talking about what happened to her anymore. She was talking about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or profession, was treated with respect and dignity. Her story touched many. She received messages from people across the country who had experienced similar challenges. They shared their own struggles and thanked Angela for giving them a voice. Each message was a reminder that Angela was not alone and that her journey had sparked a ripple effect of change. At the same time, Angela continued her work as a nurse. Her patients still needed her, and that was where her heart truly lay. She wasn't a speaker or an activist by trade, but she realized that her work in healthcare was just as important to the cause. Every day, she treated people with kindness, respect, and care. She showed them that they mattered, no matter who they were or where they came from. One afternoon, Angela found herself sitting in the hospital break room with a group of nurses. They were talking about the work they had done that day, laughing about small moments and sharing stories from their shifts. But then the conversation took a more serious turn. "I saw your interview on TV," one of the nurses said. "What you're doing, it's really inspiring." Angela smiled, her heart full. "I'm just doing what I think is right. If we don't speak up, who will?" The nurse nodded. "It's not easy, but you're showing us that we can make a difference just by standing up for ourselves and for others." Angela realized that she had come a long way. What had once been a terrifying, isolating experience had turned into something empowering, not just for her, but for others too. The support from her community, the changes in her workplace, and the growing awareness of racial justice all made her feel like she was part of a greater movement. It wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. But Angela knew one thing for sure. Her voice, along with the voices of others, was powerful. And together, they would continue to make the world a fairer, more just place for everyone. With that thought in mind, Angela took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. She was no longer just a nurse, no longer just a woman accused. She was a force for change, and she wasn't going to stop.